Lenin's goal was to create a communist utopia. Gulags, famine, religion. Education. The October Revolution is considered the most violent communist movement of the 20th century worldwide. It was the precursor for the international rise in communism and all the countless catastrophes that followed. Today, we'll go back in time and take a look at the history leading up to communism's inception. But it wouldn't be Edge of Wonder if we didn't tie it all together to the Illuma Donkey.
All right, I am Ben Burgis.
This is.
I mean, obviously, we were all waiting for the Illuma Donkey. That's also what I was waiting for and why the show started late. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I am in a different space than I usually am. This might or might not be an ongoing thing, and part of the actual explanation for the delay will come when I say that, before I got here, I was thinking, maybe I should be vague about where this space is that I'm using. And then I realized I don't have to be, because it is incredibly challenging to find. And frankly, anybody who tracks it down deserves to be on the show in studio. So yeah, at a recorded space in Silver Lake, I'm not using, because in the City of Angels, where I just moved, I'm not using all of the equipment because there were some technical problems that also contributed to the lateness. But whatever. We are here now, and I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World, and as not always, but sometimes, and always to our great pleasure, Deep State Kuba from This Is Revolution. How you guys doing today?
I'm still exhausted from, rocking so hard last weekend. Not this past weekend, but the weekend before that. And then, of course, there's the adventure getting home, but that's a whole other story. That's a podcast unto itself.
You rocked hard when you're still tired. Not from this weekend, but from the weekend before that. That is some pretty hard
recovery one.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, the main event started in a few minutes. We are in fact going to be talking about the Soviet experience and the sort of more general question of how revolutions go wrong. Because I think that this is a crucial issue that socialists don't talk about nearly enough. It's certainly a big stumbling block that a lot of people who might be sympathetic to a certain amount of what we want have about thinking about post-capitalist horizons. Is that, hey, you guys tried that. Look what happened. Why wouldn't that happen? Why wouldn't that happen again? The Bolsheviks rose to power in the crumbling Russian Empire on a platform of land, peace, and bread, and all power to the Soviets, which were democratically elected workers' councils, and ended up creating an authoritarian and often economically dysfunctional one-party state that really did have breadlines, gulags, and at its worst, and almost everything in that video, with the possible exception of the Illuma Donkey. And while we're at it, Andy, you found this video during your usual dumpster diving on Rumble to find stuff to make fun of on GTAA. What the fuck is the Illuma Donkey?
It's apparently a thing that this podcast does. I don't know these guys, but they're really professional, have a very nice space where they're recording in. And apparently it's this inside joke amongst them that best I could figure. But the whole 40-minute video is just incredible. Because I watched the whole thing and it was it was amazing. They kept tying things back to Adolf Hitler. And then they went off on some anti-Semitic tangent about how the Jews were the ones who supported Lenin. Sure. It was amazing.
A common refrain in Andy's household is like, "Daddy, Daddy, I'm hungry. Like, please, I need food or I need help with my homework." And Andy's like, "I'm watching Rumble videos for work."
I'm doing my part for the revolution.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, a couple things that I think that's a good idea. An illustration would help us all understand the historical significance of the Illuminati. But yeah, so a couple other things to hit before we go back to Russia. So one of them has to do with a book that just came out quite recently, within I think the last month, called Capitalism for Realists. I think that we have a graphic of this book. Tibor Rutar, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Routledge. And I was really interested to see this book because I have been hearing for a little while now that it includes a response to something that I wrote a couple of years ago. So if you go back into the Wayback Machine to the late fall of 2021, if anybody here can remember that far, I was going to to this conference kind of thing at a university in Washington, D.C., where they basically, it was co-sponsored by the Mercatus Center, which is a libertarian think tank, and the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And basically, they invited me and another Jacobin kind of person and a couple of libertarians to spend the weekend on panels, discussing and arguing about things. And then there were like undergrads who'd applied to go to it. And it was all good fun. But while I was preparing for this, one of the things that I had to read to get ready for this was we all had a chance to sort of throw in readings that everybody else had to do. And one of the readings the libertarians suggested was this paper by this guy, Peter Leeson, called Two Cheers for Capitalism, which I believe there we go. We've also got a graphic of. And the basic thesis, this paper, is that a lot of people, people who are just entirely too squishy about this stuff will say, now, maybe two cheers for capitalism. It does a lot of good stuff, but there are some drawbacks, and and its sort of worst excesses need to be tamed and so on. But Leeson will have none of this. Capitalism deserves three cheers. And the primary evidence that's been appealed to for saying that capitalism deserves three cheers is another libertarian think tank, the Fraser Institute, which when I first wrote about them, I was spelling it F-R. Fraser. All right. I'll take your word for it.
This is the Kelsey Grammer Institute, right? Which I think would have similar politics, right? As the
exactly. That's the version on the American side of the border.
Okay,
but the Fraser Institute is the Western Canadian libertarian think tank. So I know them
well, not only was it pronounced Fraser in my head, but when I was writing about it, the initial draft of the article I turned into Jacobin consistently spelled it like Dr. Crane's given name.
Nice.
But they have these economic freedom rankings that basically show that all of the good things are correlated with more economic freedom and all of the bad things are correlated with less economic freedom. And so I wrote about this for Jacobin, this article, Economic Freedom Rankings Don't Tell Us Anything About Capitalism. And part of what was in the Leeson article that inspired me to do this is that he makes this really, really interesting claim in the article that really jumped out at me. So I think we have the Leeson 1 graphic. So this paper is from 2005. It was an old paper, when I read it. And I want to remind you that it's 2005 because that means when he talks about a quarter century, the time frame is 1980 to 2005. Keep that in mind. So he says, although most countries became more capitalist over the past quarter century, not every country did. Many of the backsliders also enjoyed very high levels of economic freedom and backslid only minimally. For example, between 1980 and 2005, the United States became less capitalist by 0.09 points in Fraser's index. Now, I want to pause right there to say that the idea that this period that we're talking about, which is Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, is a period in which the United States became less capitalist. That's, an odd claim on the face of it. Think about the policies of those four people. I think you're muted, Andy.
I'm just kind of shocked at the thinking about this idea of us backsliding when it's Saint Ronald Reagan, the savior of the free world, who free marketed us to freedom and liberty.
Yeah, I mean that was always my understanding of what happened, and even the only Democratic president in that time frame, 1980 to 2005, was Bill Clinton, who gave us NAFTA, GATT, WTO,
repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Repeal of Glass-Steagall, exactly right. So, all of these things would not make me think that libertarians would think of this as a time frame in which the United States was becoming less economically free. But the real doozy is still coming, because says at the end of that, right? So, but it remained. Go to the next graphic. Okay, so it remained relatively capitalist. That's what they're saying. We're skipping ahead a few paragraphs. All right. Think of this as a little pop quiz. I'm really curious, which is the country name that pops out to you from this list? Fortunately, only 5 countries became significantly less capitalist over the last quarter century, when most everyone else was busy reaping the rewards of becoming more capitalist. So the last quarter century, I just want to remind you, is 1980 to 2005. These countries are Myanmar, Rwanda, Ukraine, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Each of these countries lost more than 1 point of economic freedom over the period on Fraser's 10-point scale. 10-point scale. This decline translates into a 20 to 40% loss of economic freedom, depending on the country one considers. Okay, so, all right, Myanmar, Rwanda, even Zimbabwe. I mean, Zimbabwe, I guess I'm aware of some of the land reform issues and all of that. Myanmar and Rwanda, I would not comment on their economic systems. I just know too little about this. Venezuela is okay. I think it's fucking stupid that it plays the role that it does in the right-wing imagination on this question, considering that even at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state, it had a smaller public sector than France, but whatever, put that aside. Ukraine? The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1980 was more capitalist than Ukraine in 2005?
That's amazing.
Obviously, they didn't actually start counting in 1980. However, it actually suggests something more questionable, which is the free fall, the collapse state of utter ruin at the end of the USSR, where all of a sudden production chains that had previously been seamlessly incorporated now crossed 3 international borders because the cotton was from Uzbekistan, the mill is in Russia, and the clothing factories in Estonia, right? You have utter dislocation, collapsing currency, people peddling whatever they have on the streets. And that is the glory days of economic freedom that we pine for, right? Oh no, we lost 40% of that bounteous freedom of universal starvation on the sidewalk. And now we're in the bad days, right? There's a kind of arbitrariness to these numbers, and in extremis, you're talking about collapsed systems that have their own individual characteristics, and you can't lump them together because it matters more about what informal networks are keeping people alive or what the particular diktat and planning system is maintaining what are basically wartime economies in all of these countries. Instead, you just have, oh, this is bad. Look at Zimbabwe, look at Venezuela, tusk, tisk, tisk, tut, tut.
Yeah, so in the Jacobin article, one of the main points that I was making, and I didn't even actually use the Ukraine example from Lisa, as astonishing as that was, in the article, because I couldn't reconstruct exactly what he was looking at, and I just, out of an abundance of caution, I just left it out, even though that the sort of amazingness of that claim was what first sort of, got the eyebrows lifting. But in the article, I do point out that there's a lot of very odd things about this list, that if you go to the Fraser's website, they have this interactive map you can play with that will show you where different countries are in the world. Yeah, so these are the criteria they use. Area 1, size of government. Area 2, legal and property rights. Area 3, sound money, which basically means there's a low inflation rate. Area 4, freedom to trade internationally. Area 5, regulation. And then, okay, so in a general sense, these are the criteria they use, but they have this interactive map that you can play with that'll show you where different countries in the world are and comparisons between them and all of that. And one of the things I quickly saw there is that Norway and Sweden tie for the title of the 37th most capitalist, most neoliberal, most economically free countries in the world. And Haiti is 155 or something. So the claim that Norway and Sweden are significantly, more capitalist, less socialist than Haiti, is very odd, right? That the talk about Norway, for example, there's a huge, I think a larger portion of the GDP is in state hands than in China. Because the giant state-owned oil company, or mostly state-owned oil company, obviously these places have enormous welfare.
Sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah, exactly right. So something seemed very odd here, and basically the more I dug into it, the more it seemed to me that once you sort of start looking at the subcategories and these broad categories, I think this is already obvious in the sound money one, but I think a lot of the other cases, you start looking at the subcategories, and it becomes very obvious very quickly that they're sort of that they're throwing in a lot of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with what anybody's deploying these rankings to try to prove, because they're not really anything that's at issue in arguments between socialists or supporters of capitalism, or between social democrats and libertarians. It's not if there's a lot of lawlessness and corruption, they'll count that as more capitalist because you need robust rule of law to have effective markets. It's okay, wait a second.
Yeah, exactly. They're just sneaking in a whole bunch of standard issue good governance into their definition of capitalism, which makes it very easy for them to then have the conclusion that look at how capitalism is associated with good governance.
Yeah, exactly. So what they're doing pretty consistently is they're counting countries. The more good outcomes a country has, the more capitalist they're counting it as, and then they're concluding that voila, capitalism is correlated with all these good outcomes. And that's sort of a not very interesting trick. And in fact, even if you look at the if you go back to that graphic we just had with the 5 criteria on it, that the one that sounds the one from their website, that the one that sounds the most like it's actually going to have something to do with capitalism and socialism is the legal system and property rights. Hey, property rights is in there. Now we're talking, right? And I dig into this in the article. So one of the things that that I say in the article is, well, hold on. You break down within that legal system of property rights, and you get all these subcategories. judicial independence, impartial courts, protection of property rights, military interference, rule of law in politics, something socialists love, ask Salvador Allende, integrity of the legal system, legal enforcement of contracts, regulatory costs and sales of real property, and reliability of police. Now, again, as Kuba just said, almost all of these are just good government things that have absolutely nothing to do with anything that's really a dispute in capitalism versus socialism arguments. And so one of the things that I say in the article is that I say of these 8 categories, C, that's the one about property rights, is the only one that sounds remotely relevant to the capitalism versus socialism debate. And even there, it's only relevant if that property is being protected. What property is being protected for is nationalization or expropriation by the workers themselves, as in Argentina's recovered factory movement in the early 2000s. At a stretch, G might also be salient, although the regulatory costs socialists want to impose on businesses, like better workplace safety laws, a higher minimum wage, measures to make it harder to bust unions, rarely have much to do with the sale of businesses. Reading this, I think I was being way too generous. I was stretching over backwards trying to give them a second one to say it was halfway relevant, but really regulatory costs of selling businesses has nothing to do with anything. Really, the only thing on this entire list that has anything to do with capitalism versus socialism is C, protection of property rights. But again, remember the point that I'm making in the Jacobin article is I don't say, oh yeah, C is clearly relevant to capitalism socialism. I say it's the only one that sounds remotely relevant to the capitalism socialism debate. And even there, it's only relevant if what property is being protected from is nationalization or expropriation by the workers themselves. So the reason I'm belaboring this is that when I actually looked with great excitement after all these months of being told by people like Chris Wright, who's a libertarian professor I'll argue with on Twitter, that this book contains a refutation of this Jacobin article in response to this criticism of the Fraser methodology. Well, here's what it actually says. It says that to neoliberal, so he's going off the Fraser numbers. He says, to conclude, neoliberalism, defined as increasing or high rates of economic freedom, tends to be directly or at least indirectly associated with many positive social outcomes, both correlationally and causally, although there are a few plausible negatives as well. Does this settle, at least in rough terms, neoliberalism's overall social performance? Says not necessarily. The problem with the assessment I've presented above could be that not everyone agrees with the proposed method of measuring neoliberalism. Writing for the popular Marxist journal Jacobin, Ben Burgis argues that one should not conflate Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index with how capitalistic, or for our purposes, neoliberal a country is. For him, a big concern is... okay, so it's ahead a little bit, says, so I think this is, again, a couple paragraphs later. So a little bit cut off here, but it says, that a bunch of these metrics don't seem to have anything to do with how capitalistic a given country's set of economic institutions is. He says there are conceptual problems with Burgess's critique. By the way, the reader is left guessing about what the conceptual problems are. I mean, this is a book. The guy's got space. He could have devoted as many pages as he wanted to. It's not, it's not like, is Ulysses length already. The publisher was telling him that, he had to cut it down, or, they just couldn't afford him as much paper. It's like a perfectly reasonably length book. He could have spent a couple pages telling us what the conceptual problems are. He does not. But let us, for the sake of argument, it still does not necessarily follow from his critique that the Economic Freedom Index becomes useless. Instead, we have to examine whether it in fact does so. For instance, we can look at how the relative standards of particular countries change. Were we to recalculate the index by eschewing the access to sound money category and 7 of the 8 subcategories, the legal structure in property rights area due to their alleged irrelevance to capitalism. And basically he concludes, hey, you just look at protection of property rights and, and it's still, all the good things are still correlated with that and all the bad things are still correlated with the lack of it. But, I mean, you just saw what it said in the article. I didn't say, oh yeah, this one's totally legit. I said it's the only one that sounds remotely relevant. But even there, it would only be relevant if the thing property rights were being protected against was nationalization or, expropriation by the workers, which, to spell this point out, in 99.99999% of real cases, socialist revolutions being rare things in world history, is not what any measure of property rights is about, right? It's about stuff like, protection against crime or protection against just like, corrupt officials, who are hurting their enemies and helping their friends and, and all that stuff. So again, I don't know, man. I think I want to believe that the Canadians could do better than this. It's a lovely country.
Don't forget, these are Albertans for the most part.
Okay.
Canada is not a monolith, Ben. You've struggled with this kind of racism before. Many different. There's a lot of pluralism there. Like, wait, you're from Canada? Where deep space?
Well,
I live in British Columbia.
Okay,
exactly. I live in
British Columbia, he knows all about the Connexit. Is that what they were calling it?
Wexit.
Wexit. That was it. Yes, Wexit.
Mm-hmm. It was Alberta throwing a temper tantrum that they weren't going to have their government after the last Trudeau election. And so they're like, well, fine, we're going to leave. We're taking Saskatchewan. We're taking the territories. We're taking British Columbia. And it's like, wait. We don't like you. Why do you think that we're going to leave? Why is this a Wexit and not an Albexit, right? Because if the choice is between Ottawa and Calgary, it's Ottawa every fucking time. Because fuck you guys and the horses you rode in. I will not deny that Albertans are Canadians, but I will not confirm that they are human beings.
All right. Strong words. Well, I await the critique of the article from the British Columbians. I'm sure that will be more rigorous. But I think that it looks like Derrick Varn, at least, might be ready to join us. Mean Djene might be another minute. Should we bring in Varn? Hello. All right. So we are waiting for Djene, and did want to hit just a couple of other things before we start the main event for today. So let me just ask both of you guys. I don't know, if either of you is paying attention at the right level of detail. Oh, here we go. I think we've got Djene. Yeah. All right. So paying attention at the right level of detail to the race for the 2024 Republican nomination for this guy to be on your radar. But anybody know about Vivec Ramaswamy?
The new Republican candidate, right?
Yeah.
Republican Andrew Yang?
Something like that, yeah. I guess like Yang, right? And like Trump in 2016, for that matter, he's a business guy. He doesn't have any political experience. But I just wrote something about him for Jacobin because I was really struck by looking at his signature policy proposal. So a lot of what Ramaswamy wants is what all the Republicans want, to invade Mexico, for example. All the Republican candidates right now, I think, on record to say they want to do that. But Ramaswamy's most interested suggestion is that the automatic voting rights be held until the age of 25. So 18 to 24-year-olds would be disenfranchised, which is not even the most interesting to this to me, because look, what exactly the cutoff? I mean, 25 is awfully high, but exactly the cutoff for various measures of adulthood, driving, voting, drinking, etc., is a little culturally arbitrary anyway. I suppose 25 might sound less crazy to me, for the sake of argument, if I grown up in a society which set it at least a few years older than it does. But what really struck me about this is that this would just, on Ramaswamy's proposal, this would just be the cutoff for automatic voting rights. But he's not going to say 18 to 24-year-olds can't vote no matter what. He's willing to allow them to vote if they jump through one of a few different hoops. So there's a poll test option, pass a civic, some kind of civics test. Great history there. They can get jobs as first responders, or my favorite option is that he thinks that they should be able to earn the right to vote by serving in the military, which I have to say, when I heard that part, that you can get voting rights by serving in the Army, it immediately made me think about this.
Young people from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part. I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part, too.
They're doing their part. Are you? Join the mobile infantry and save the world. Service guarantees citizenship.
Well, yes, I would like to know more.
The Heinlein platform.
Service guarantees citizenship.
I don't know, would you like to know more? That feels like a bad instinct to encourage.
Well, let me just say this. I think there's a lot of liberals as well who would like to impose some kind of test on people for voting. This fundamentally speaks to some of the fundamental problems in American politics, or at least mainstream politics, that the idea is that, both liberals and conservatives think that the opposition and the people who vote for the other party are brainwashed morons who, don't know anything. And so there's always this kind of discussion. Obviously, it's a lot stronger on the Republican side, as you have this tradition, this kind of I find it very funny that you have all these effete South Asian immigrants in the West who are adopting the most macho, masculine, right-wing politics that there is, and this kind of warrior ether. Maybe it's the Aryans come back. But they are all dark-skinned Indians. They aren't the light-skinned Aryan warrior cats. But you have this bizarre thing on the right with the service, which in reality means military service. I mean, they're not going to give it to people who go teach in inner city schools, are they? They aren't going to give it to the people who, a 21-year-old who signs up to clean up the municipal sewers, which is probably for most sewage workers probably pretty similar in levels of danger to working in the military.
Although they may order military units to clean up sewers.
There you go. You could the two birds with one stone. But on the left, I see this kind of discourse where it's they shouldn't let these. Obviously, it's less formal, but it's a distrust of the population, and this notion, on the left comes from Orwell about the brainwashing and stuff like that, which I think is a lot more. Obviously, people have distorted consciousness and there's miseducation, but I think people aren't as gullible or stupid as I think many liberal and conservative political elites see them. So I see this.
Or alternatively, the gullibility and stupidity goes up to the liberal and conservative elite pundit level. Therefore, they shouldn't be allowed to vote either.
My favorite thing here is that it seems clear that a push to raise the voting age and only let military veterans below the age of 25 vote is a way to reconservatize the electorate through disenfranchisement. The problem is, to truly do that in this day and age, you'd need to have the voting cutoff age be about 55. So it probably won't even work, not that they could do it anyway. It's pretty clear that there's also some real worry right now that even the poverty draft isn't working. So, most of the military at the current moment, it's military families, it's declining base, the military itself is declining in its membership. It's now 3/4, multi-generational households from the middle class, but that's when the military is in an operative mode. It tends to be a lot more poor in it, or if we go back pre-Vietnam War, a lot more draftees, and you can't really bring back the draft because that would probably lead to less military actions and police actions being viable because there'd be a lot more pushback on it. You can't
also, you'd be incorporating unreliable elements within the security apparatus.
Yeah,
you draft people, you're no longer gatekeeping.
Yeah, if you incorporate every able-bodied 18-year-old, period, you just taught a bunch of leftists how to use guns. So,
and conscription democratizes foreign policy to a certain extent because everybody has like a fundamental stake in it. One of the big, Danny Bessner always talks about this. One of the reasons that foreign policy is so detached from any democratic control is because in order to exercise it, you don't actually have to involve that many people. It's not a live political question in the way that something like Vietnam was, because people were either drafted or they were scared that they were going to get drafted, or their kids were going to get drafted, or their family was going to get drafted. So God forbid a draft, because that is I think tactically the left should support a draft, but I think
I will say this much, because I remember, I'm old enough to remember this being a argument that came up a lot in like the early 2000s, right? This was a big Bush era argument. I think John Conyers actually, whatever. It's obviously there's no chance of it passing, but introduced like a conscription bill for exactly that reason you guys have been talking about during the Bush years. I will say that this idea that a draft sort of automatically means more resistance to intervention, I do wonder about it, because I think about places that either currently have or have had a draft. I think about Israel. I think about the United States. During the decades, before the Vietnam War. When Korea was happening, etc. Think about South Korea. Not that not South Korea is sending troops around the world, but it's like but also I like doesn't exactly have massive draft resistance or anything. And I wonder if like Vietnam, like we're sort of treating Vietnam as like the kind of standard way that having a draft plays out, when that was actually relatively unusual, that you had like a big war where people were dying all the time, and a draft, and a country that wasn't really conservative enough to just kind of lay down and accept it.
Well, don't forget too that the Eastern Bloc also had mandatory military service, including the possibility of deployment to Afghanistan for Soviet soldiers. Mm-hmm. And that had a very similar effect to Vietnam in the late Soviet Union. Similarly, conscription extraordinarily unpopular in countries like Poland, a real lightning rod for anti-regime opposition, to the point where by the end of the system, 1/3 or more of eligible conscripts were just getting a free pass, like whatever bullshit pretext they came up with was getting rubber stamped in order to keep them out, because enforcing that service on the type of population, oppositional population you had in Poland, was just recognized as being regime threatening.
So the one thing I will say about the U.S. in the period before Vietnam is the earliest opposition to Vietnam actually came from Korean vets, not from the youth. The stats actually back that up. The beginnings of the Vietnam War were actually more unpopular in the 30 to 40 set than it was in the 20 to 30 set during the first years of the war. That was to flip later. I actually, it's a hard thing for a socialist to be honest about. On one hand, I actually do think that a draft is remarkably. The reason why it works and democratizes military service is that if you actually use it, it's monstrous.
Mhm.
Like, unless you're using it in the case of a defensive war, in which case you don't need it. But the other thing is that in a socialist society, one would have to actually advocate that such functions, and not just military functions, police functions, all kinds of social service functions, are shared by everybody in the society. So you do have to, there's not a simple answer to that. But I will also say that it's also objectively true that I think some of the hope that a draft democratizes the use of the military is based off the premise that the deployment of the military is democratic, which after the Police Powers Act in the United States, and that's when we quit declaring war ever, is a questionable assumption.
The War Powers Act. Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, the War Powers Act is actually to rein in the police powers given to it with the UN Treaty. Excuse me. So, but all of them end up, because the War Powers Act is actually supposed to limit what Eisenhower claimed under the UN Treaty. But all of them enable you to easily invest U.S. soldiers into a war without declaring war, because you can stick boots in the ground. And what are you going to do? Is Congress going to defund it once that happens? They never have. Lately,
kind of the very end of Vietnam, but yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, while we are talking about Vietnam, one other last thing I did want to hit before we got to the main event for tonight is that I've been off for the last few weeks. We had we ran the New York City live show video instead of an episode last Monday. The Monday before that, our good friend Jason Miles came in and guest hosted. So it's been about 3 weeks since we did a normal episode, and in that time, it's a little dated now, but when a friend of the show, has a big birthday, a big milestone birthday, I don't want to completely neglect it. So do just want to say Henry Kissinger has hit his 100 since the last episode of the show, and I don't know exactly what he did to celebrate that occasion. If there's if there's like footage from any event that was held on his actual 100th birthday. I haven't seen it, but I did, while researching that article for Jacobin about Kissinger's 100th birthday, I did find some footage of Kissinger at his old boss Richard Nixon's posthumous 100th birthday party. I think Nixon died when he was in his 80s, maybe. That was he died in the late 90s, and I think he was in his 80s at that point. But posthumously, there was a 100th birthday celebration for Richard Nixon, and and Dr. Kissinger was there, and he gave a birthday toast to Richard Nixon, which we can see here, him giving the toast, and then some of Dr. Kuba's colleagues lifted their glasses upon hearing it.
It is my honor to propose a toast to Richard Nixon, patriot, president, and above all, peacemaker.
And American.
Made Cuba run away.
Yeah, he's crying. He's just gone to cry. He's gone to get his wine for tricky. Oh, he's quieted himself.
Yeah, Kuba, you're muted if you had meant to say something.
After that toast, I needed to get more wine.
Well, he made peace with China, you know.
Yeah, I mean that is the germ of truth in it, that Nixon was willing to pursue, pragmatic détente with China, and for that matter the Soviet Union. Although I have to say, what I immediately flashed to when I was watching that toast to Richard Nixon as a peacemaker from Henry Kissinger is a classic quote from a transcript of a conversation between Kissinger and his deputy national security advisor, in which they're talking about the instructions that Kissinger had gotten from Richard Nixon about the bombing campaign in Cambodia. So this is Alexander Haig is the deputy he's talking to, who would later be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe under Jimmy Carter, and then the Secretary of State under Reagan. So bipartisanship. But this is the exchange they have that you can see in the transcript, because of course it's a recorded White House call. Kissinger, too, he wants a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. He doesn't want to hear anything. It's an order. It's to be done. Anything that flies on anything that moves. You got that? And then the transcript says, couldn't hear, but sounded like Haig laughing.
Classic.
Good stuff. Lovely people,
Arguably, Kissinger is the great digger of communism, right? Because the Sino-Soviet split being maintained by the particular way détente was pursued actually does make the continued viability of the Soviet Union really, really hard. Not that started the Sino-Soviet split. That probably goes all the way back to the 1920s. But, I don't know. He's evil enough that I think he might never die. I've just decided that maybe I'm not usually a metaphysician or anything, but I don't know. Maybe enough babies have been sacrificed in his name that he's just never going to die.
But let me play Kissinger defense. How about this? There you go.
Sure.
So, Kissinger is despised not just on the socialist left, but a large swath of liberal opinion despises Kissinger as well.
I will say just on the subject of liberal opinion and Kissinger, that that's certainly like mainstream liberal Democrats who get elected president, by and large like him. Remember that
Sure.
Hillary Clinton in the 2016 primary debates said that he was a good friend and trusted advisor, and then Bernie brought up Salvador Allende, and everybody sort of reacted as if he was just making up names out of thin air, and in fact, apparently, after Nixon left office, Ford kept him on in his dual role as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He finally left the White House after Ford left. But every single president after Ford and before Biden, that would be Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, all at some point had Kissinger over to the White House for foreign policy discussions and advice about
Tea
war
and
and diplomacy.
adrenochrome.
Chrome. The only exception so far is Joe Biden. Now, of course, there's still time, but the thing that I really want to note about this is, as much as I would like to believe that the reason that he hasn't gotten an invite to the Biden White House is that Joe Biden disapproves of all the genocides. I think it's a lot more likely that he's actually not invited to the Biden White House for not being enough of a warmonger, because early on in the war in Ukraine, he sort of made some vague comments about how pursuing negotiations might be a good idea.
Yeah.
Or Biden might think he still works for Richard Nixon.
That's another. No, but amongst sort of left liberal academics and media and journalist types, he's kind of,
Anthony Bourdain has that famous quote that once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands.
Yeah. So there is a significant portion of left liberal opinion that despises Nixon. But, as managers of American empire go, he's not sui generously worse than some of the other people who have come up.
Zbigniew Brzezinski is kind of like the Democratic Nixon
version. Yeah, you've got Mika's daddy, and I don't mean Joe Scarborough. I mean her real daddy, and also look at all the neocons. Look at Hillary Clinton's behavior as Secretary of State. Just look at the entire American foreign policy establishment of the last 40 years. When people, people single out Henry Kissinger as the sui generis evil, I think there's a tendency in that singling out to kind of put the sins of American empire on this one guy and say, like, oh, look, it's this really bad guy, Nixon. Nixon had this Henry Kissinger guy who was this particularly evil guy. He was just a kind of foreign policy realist exercising foreign policy realism in a way that foreign policy realists do, right? Which is like you look at the world as a power politics game. I mean, is that like worse than the stuff the neocons did? Is that worse than Samantha Powers and the right to intervention? If we look at the utilitarian cost of it all, the war on terror is like pretty barbarous as things go. So I think go ahead.
I think that the argument made about Henry Kissinger, the most persuasive takedown is actually Christopher Hitchens, who challenges that whole, he was just a manager of empire doing what realpolitik required of him, in pointing out that the outcome of many of Kissinger's signature initiatives ended up boomeranging back on the United States.
I think realism. So foreign policy realism is a shitty way of looking at the world, and it's like it's not an endorsement of realism.
And Hitchens, his great point is like, look, the issue isn't that this guy was an unprincipled, was ruthless and unprincipled in maintaining stability. The real case against him is that he was a geopolitical arsonist. He created instability wherever he went, and even when he did secure a pro-American outcome, it often was needlessly costly to the United States, not to mention everybody else involved.
So I will say that in the Jackman article, it's actually called Henry Kissinger is a disgusting war criminal, but the rock goes deeper than him. And ultimately, the argument of the article is a version of part of what Gene said, right? That it's I don't think it negates the Hitchens point about Kissinger as a geopolitical arsonist who didn't really guarantee stability in practice, but that as much as I will be certainly not shed any tears when if and when Kissinger eventually dies, taking into account Varn's point about how he might not, I will be not disappointed when that happens. In fact, I'm regularly disappointed when I see Kissinger's name trending on Twitter and I realize that it's not because he's dead. And it's certainly, if in the spectacularly unlikely event that he actually had to see the inside of a courtroom before he died, I think that would be a fantastic outcome. But I also think it's a mistake, and this is ultimately the argument of the piece, to think that there's anything really unique about Kissinger. I think that if anything, I think maybe the unique thing about Kissinger is just that he's sort of so plain spoken about it, right? That he, anything that flies, anything that moves, or the, what's the classic Kissinger line about Salvador Allende? I don't see why countries should be allowed to go communist just because the voters are irresponsible. That the fact that he's willing to say stuff like that out loud, and if anything, sort of cultivates this very evil persona. I think maybe makes him seem more unique than he really is. I think the very fact
I remember one quote that he had. He was selecting some response to a particular question that was being circulated in the media. And he said, "Okay, let's go with this one. It's very useful for our interests. It doesn't reveal too much, and it also has the secondary benefit of being true."
I actually was thinking about this the other day because I remember noting Kissinger's passing, and we were talking about realism. I don't know what realism actually is, because both Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski are realists, but also Peter Zion and what's his name, John Mearsheimer, are both realists. And their politics are diametrically opposed, except that they both dislike China, but their answer to China is remarkably different, even if they're both warlike. And I bring that up because when we talk about these things, I'm like, okay, well, the number one, if we want to talk about like the real time that America had evil emperors who were competent and also not particularly ghoulish, only basically ghoulish, you got to go back to like George Kennan, which is 50s, 60s, pre-Kissinger. And there is something true. We talk about how Kissinger is the person who just said it out loud. I mean, I think I'm always like taken aback by how much foreign policy and military advisors now will just say, like, they'll let the game out verbatim. I suggest that people want to see this. Mearsheimer, actually a little bit before Kissinger, gave a talk in Australia that I was like, he is so blatant about what he's advocating in regards to war in China that he might as well be anti-war by accident.
Well, I think there's a lot of that with opposition to American involvement in Ukraine. There are a lot of people in that position who are pretty upfront about the fact that their reason is that is that being in a global confrontation with Russia distracts us from being in a global confrontation with China like we should. But yeah, so I did just want to plug this interview with Daniel Bessner and Jacobin from almost exactly a year ago today. How should the left think about realism in foreign policy? I think he has some nuanced and worthwhile things to say there. But yeah, I would also urge that, like, just the fact that Kissinger not only has not been put on trial in any of the decades since his involvement in these crimes, but that other than Biden so far, everybody's admitted him to the White House in that time. He's still treated as an elder statesman, is maybe in itself a sign that he's not really as unique as we might like to think. But I do want to switch gears because in the time we have left, I do want to make sure that we can really get into the main thing that I wanted people on to discuss, because the kind of idea, the germ of this episode was a few weeks ago. I was watching our Socialist Brother podcast, This is Revolution, and in there was a point in the champagne room where they were taking calls, and there was this call that I found really interesting. Jake, I think we have the video of this.
Caller, what's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Isaac. I'm calling from Portland.
Oh, hey, Portland, Isaac.
Hey, long-time listener, first-time caller. Actually, something a bit off the topic. Going back to kind of what the video or the interview from with Chris Catrone last week, and a bit of what we touched on earlier during the discussion. I guess an issue that comes to mind is we have a pretty long history of leftist revolutionary activism. Most of it is failed, but where it succeeded, we also have a lot of regimes that turned into something other than what we were hoping for. How do we reckon with that potential without simply turning, without giving up,
And I think in the context, I think so. The guests, as those of you who are watching, if you're like doing dishes and the YouTube's on in the background, you did see, but the guests were Varn and Djene, and one of the reasons I thought it'd be interesting to revisit this and also to make the panel, more Polish, is that. In the context of that discussion, I will say, I think he had very good excuse, but I think Varn was a little bit distracted when he was answering the question because of some of what had gone on earlier in the champagne room, and I think that it sort of got the answer to this got very like focused on like one dimension of this. But I actually thought it might be worth an episode of its own, or at least an episode where we could spend a good 45 minutes talking about it, because I think this is a really important question that doesn't get probably does not get as much play as it should, because both sort of in principle and because and also because if you're serious about convincing people to believe in a horizon that goes past capitalism, this is a extremely understandable point of hesitation for many, many people. Because, as we said earlier, say, hey, didn't you guys do this already and it didn't go well? Shouldn't, why is it, right? If like revolution or revolutions in the past have gone terribly wrong, and as Isaac from Portland said, have ended up creating outcomes, have created regimes, have created kinds of societies very different from what was anticipated by the people originally making the revolution, then you kind of owe it to people now to have a theory of the case, to have view on why that happened and what lessons could be learned from it, and why you're sort of something about the game plan perhaps for making sure it doesn't happen again. So I want to open this up to our panel, and I mean kind of both, because I think there are two sort of dimensions of this that both deserve some play. One is Russia specific, because if you're really we're talking about Russia here, because most of when people say revolutions, for the most part later they're talking about revolution that are made by capital C communists who already had the Soviet Union as a model and sort of saw their goal as replicating that model. So really we're talking about the Russian Revolution. So one is a Russia specific angle, right? It happened there. And then the other one is are there sort of broader lessons here, right? Like if some of what happened in Russia was Russia specific, right? Is everything that happened in Russia Russia specific? Are there things that are sort of more general problems or issues here? So I wonder if we want to start at least as the boxes appear on my screen clockwise. So if we want to start with Dr. Kuba.
So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the problem of revolutionary transformation within societies. How does it happen? What are the conditions that start it? what are the determinants of the shape of the outcome. And there's some commonalities about how you get to a revolution. So to a certain extent, like all revolutions do share some basic characteristics. One is that the old system has to break, right? The old dispensation that allowed for the maintenance of political authority and a security structure, that ends. And something that turbulence creates an opportunity for political actors that had been frozen out of the old dispensation to enter politics and to assert a radically different vision of how authority should be structured, what the relationship should be between state and its population, even a reevaluation of morality. You know, there's something Nietzschean in a genuine revolution where you take the idols and effigies that were held sacred and you replace them with new touchstones of value and meaning. And to have a system that's in that desperate a condition usually requires some serious crisis, often economic, sometimes economic and military, sometimes just military. But a losing war exhaustion, conquest, experience of international humiliation, right? Like one way that a regime loses legitimacy is it fails to protect you from the outsiders that it's supposed to keep out. And another is that no matter how much your life sucks otherwise, you should be able to have bread. You should be able to live day by day. If the bread isn't coming and the enemies aren't kept outside the gates but are come inside the house, then what point does what's the point of the old system of authority? So one thing that you have to reckon with is a system that's crashing. Good, solid conditions, optimal. You know, we've got a budget surplus. We have wonderful outcomes on every single metric. We're at the top of the Fraser Institute's index. You don't have a revolution under those conditions. You're not going to have a Norwegian revolution because the Norwegian system works. You're not going to have an Icelandic revolution because the Icelandic system works. The only times you will get change in countries that are functional are when the functional equilibrium is ruined by external events, exogenous shock, and then maybe you'll have experimentation with something new, or as in the case of Iceland after the 2008 financial crisis, you just have the reestablishment of the old system, just purged of the elements that led to the immediate crisis. So revolutions always take place under very strained and difficult conditions. And to distinguish a revolution versus a restoration, it also has to include outside elements, people who don't have experience running this apparatus. They don't know how to manage this society because they've been frozen out of the politics. And so the creation of alternative institutions becomes their means of generating a replacement state. You know, Soviets instead of the Duma, instead of the Sobor, instead of the Tsarist apparatus. However, revolutions also create lots of losers. And typically the losers are the people who had the most influence and most access to resources and coercive capacity and international connections within the old system. So any revolution that fails to account the blowback that it will, by its very nature, engender, endangers its own existence. A lot of revolutions just get snuffed out. We're interested in this very strange category of revolutions that succeed but then don't deliver their expectations. One reason for that too is if you're going to have a revolutionary call, an appeal for people to cast off the old gods the old idols, the old allegiances. Give up on the king, give up on the lords, give up on the priests, give up on God, and instead take your future in your own hands. Go out, risk your life, storm the Bastille, storm the Winter Palace, stand up to the Cossacks, stand up to the Marines, right? Put your life on the line in a situation where you know many of you will die. It's just a question of who, just a question of whether you succeed or not. You need some inspiration, something to hope for. And those promises for that new horizon are often simply unattainable, right? Especially in the short to medium term, right? Like getting from the October Revolution to luxury automated space communism was always going to be a 100-year process. If you went in believing that this promise was something that could be fulfilled immediately or in a short term, or that progress would be readily traceable, then you're very quickly going to be disappointed. So one reason why we have so many failed leftist revolutions is because the appeal, the promise made by leftist revolutions is such a difficult one to fulfill. And that's not just true of leftist revolutions. For instance, the Meiji Restoration originally began as a counter-shogun revolution of extreme xenophobic nationalist Japanese reaction. And its promise was revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. Instead, the Meiji period is the one where the barbarian is literally invited into the gates and his ways are adapted and forcibly introduced across Japanese society, precisely the opposite of what had been promised. So revolutions in general don't really achieve what the people beginning them are promised. Very seldom. The French Revolution didn't either. The American Revolution, well, look at what, Thomas Paine wasn't particularly satisfied with the outcome. And so you have this additional background characteristic of the type of ideology that can inspire a political revolution has to be millenary. It has to have something transcendent, even if the ideology that's inspiring the revolution is a deeply materialist one, right? To believe in communism goes beyond and to struggle to give up your life, right? For communism means more than looking for a better material outcome for yourself and your immediate family. There is a metaphysical commitment to it. Ironic for a movement that tends to disparage metaphysics. But it's difficult to sustain. And then there's the whole problem of how do you manage revolutionary violence in ways where violence is necessary to preserve your revolutionary project. You're going to get whites, you're going to get counter-revolutionaries, you're going to get emigres. Every revolution has always, every major revolution, whether conservative or leftist, whether liberal or socialist, has always been followed by foreign intervention and war. The American Revolution, the Meiji Restoration, the revolutions in China, from the Taiping Rebellion to the Boxer Rebellion to the Sun Yat-sen's movements and the early Kuomintang to the Chinese Revolution, revolutions in all across Europe, whether Spartacist, the French Revolution, always intervention, war, and the challenge of fighting for your survival. And especially when you marry together the reality of having an immature political movement that's not familiar with the security apparatus of the state that it inherits, against much better mobilized and much better resourced enemies looking to its total extinction, then you're going to have conditions for a very inefficient security response that will either fail, and with it goes the revolution, or it will succeed in ways that may be excessively ruthless or destructive, with severe consequences for its ability to fulfill its political promises, just because these are people who don't know what they're doing, trying to figure out issues of life and death on the fly. There's finally, to wrap in the third thing that I mentioned, which is the eschatological millenarian vision of political revolution. If you have that level of commitment, the level of commitment which allows you to die for a cause, then it also blinds you to the suffering that you're inflicting on your enemies. It makes it very easy to kill for the cause, and not just people who might deserve it for very specific reasons, right? Like the Cossack that's leveling his gun at your comrades in real time, right? It's him or your comrade, so take your pick. But also, what about the Cossack's wife? She's now that you've killed them, now that you've disposed of them, isn't she an unreliable element, right? All of these potential threats that you're constantly surrounded by, the people who refuse to fight, who refuse the appeal of history, of the urgent moment, it's easy to dismiss their suffering as just being necessary for your overall revolutionary goal, thus opening the door for industrial scale repression. And I've spoken at length, so I'll leave it there.
Fair enough.
So Dr. Kuba talked a lot about revolution in general, and that we can include national revolutions, proletarian revolutions, communist revolutions, etc. And all those in my categorizations are slightly different things. One thing we can say in specific to the Russian case is that it was developmentally limited. It was predicated on joining up with socialist revolutions which failed in other areas, which would have made its developmental limitations less of a problem. Its attempt to establish national autonomy with areas that were formerly parts of the Russian Empire actually complicated things immediately and caused what national autonomy meant to be consistently redefined even before Stalin. As soon as you have the Georgian affair in 1922 in the context of the Russian Civil War, you are already getting into limiting the power of independent socialist polities, of which you have yourself said that they were independent and Sovietized enough to be participating in the Grand Union. Those are specific to the USSR. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which I butcher, sorry, I can't pronounce anything Polish or Russian, it also is a major limitation because it kind of puts you in a situation of a claim to need to expand, but then an unwillingness to do so, which is going to drain your internal resources. Another thing that we have to look at in the case of the Russian Revolution that is different from prior bourgeois revolutions and national liberation revolutions in specific is that there's an international promise and an existing socialist apparatus, which the 21 points that they release actually forces the entire socialist movement all over the world to split upon. This limits your allies. All right. Now, some of those things in the 21 points that kind of split the socialist internationals from the communist internationals caused the Second International to more or less collapse for a little while and then get reconstituted a couple of times. Are things that I think would be worth fighting for. Others are absolutely not. For example, just to put it in perspective, the Socialist Party of America was one of the few socialist parties that voted in line with what the Bolsheviks would have wanted, for all of its flaws and internal racist debates, etc. That was definitely the case. But Eugene Debs could not sign on to the 21 points. All right, which means that you were immediately, in the case of the communist revolution, you were immediately dividing the socialist world in such a way that you were limiting allies of other groups that shared your goals and ideologies. That's a problem. Another problem
I just want to say, I mean, like, that after World War One, when the Socialist International, the Second International, got back together, I mean, they did send an invite to the Bolsheviks to participate in the new international conference, and they said, no, screw you, you guys are traitors, which there's some understandable backstory there in terms of the attitude of most of those parties initially towards World War One. But there might be a case being made that was ultimately a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, it leads to third periodism, which, while that actually ends up being kind of a good thing in the U.S., it's a disaster in Europe. But nonetheless, let's focus back on the revolution here. You also have a civil war. Now, I'm just going to point out that I can't think of a revolution that is not either a civil war or immediately results in a civil war. In the case of the Bolshevik Revolution and the October Revolution, there is a war that leads to the February Revolution. The October Revolution is not really a war. Whether or not you think it's a coup is a matter of debate and perspective, even among socialists. But it's not bloodless. But it also was not nearly as bloody as any other element of the event, including the Civil War, which came after, which was the bloodiest part of the whole affair. That is similar to the United States, where our Civil War is actually the bloodiest part, and I consider it part of our long revolution. So it's something to consider. You're going to have to deal with that, and that introduces almost conditions of maximum entropy into a society. The kinds of things that Dr. Cooper is talking about, reprisals, where you cut off reprisals, etc., immediately spread throughout society, and all kinds of other pent-up things, a lot of which have nothing to do with socialism or capitalism at all, are released. I mean, you look at what happens in the Great Proletarian Social Revolution. I am a kind of a defender. It's one of the few things about about Maoism I'll defend.
Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Yeah.
But
one of the things that it does is it unleashes all this ethnic conflict in parts of China. All right. There's like Toisanese reprisals on Han and vice versa. There's a lot of Han revanchism on the Manchus, etc. This is something that nobody in this system wants, but the violence of these events unleashes it. Now, I'm also going to say something somewhat controversial, given the violence of Chinese revolutions, and I'm not just talking about the one, also going back all the way back to the quote Boxer Rebellion, which had 8 times more people die in it than the U.S. Civil War. I just want people to let that simmer in their brain. The Cultural Revolution was relatively not bloody. A lot of people died. But when you look at the deaths in, say, the 30s or the deaths in the 1890s, it's not as many as one would.
Or even in the Taiping Rebellion.
Yeah.
It's like tens of millions.
Right. Which is not to say that's justified, but you do have to look at this on scale.
But there's also, I think the great distinguishing feature of the Cultural Revolution, as opposed to Taiping, as opposed to the Boxer Rebellion, as opposed to the 1930s, the century of humiliation, warlordism, you name it, Japanese invasion, is that it was unnecessary. Mm-hmm. That was a revolution of choice. The PRC was already entrenched. You didn't have to do it. But they did, which is a challenge.
It's unnecessary from the standpoint of stability. It is not unnecessary from the standpoint of what they said they were aiming to do. The question that you have to answer in all these cases is how do you incorporate these former elements of the prior society into your society, and can you let them remain what they were?
Well, there's also, but that presupposes that you've even produced that new society, which I think is much more of a question and much more of a challenge. That post-revolutionary generation, translating the revolution made of people who were product of the pre-revolutionary society into a system that can raise children, that can educate a new generation, that can pass on what the revolution is supposed to be, that can sort of pass the torch on what's a generational many generation project. That's a very tall order, and one of the places where a revolution can go very wrong.
I'm not disagreeing with you that the Cultural Revolution was both poorly handled and very destabilizing. However, it is also the only time in which many communist promises were actually done, and in which democratization of things like education and healthcare were attempted in China. They are rolled back afterwards, but we're not really talking about that right now. I mean, one of the things that I'm pointing out here is that the Cultural Revolution is an attempt to actually deliver on that new society a generation out.
And that's actually one major issue with leftist revolutions specifically.
Right.
The part of the appeal of a revolution for individuals exhausted by the failure of the old system is the promise that you can return to something like normalcy, right? That's the whole Biden appeal, in fact. But normalcy is not going to be luxury, automated, femboy communism. And if we need to get to luxury, automated, femboy communism, which, let's face it, what's the point of mankind except to achieve that? Yeah. Then, like maybe we have to do more. But that does mean kind of betraying the people who just want to get back to normal.
Yeah.
Some form of new normalcy.
So the point that I should say the original discussion on TIR that Gene made there, which I mean I think has been kind of glancingly referred to here, but maybe deserves to be highlighted a little bit more, is that surely if the question is okay, if the broader question is how revolutions go wrong, and the more specific question is how did the Russian Revolution go wrong, then surely part of the answer to that is that nobody, certainly not the original leaders of the Russian Revolution, because they were way too orthodox Marxists to believe this, thought that you could skip straight from a semi-feudal, mostly agrarian, like mostly pre-capitalist society with some islands of capitalism in the cities like Moscow and Petrograd, that you could skip from that to the fully automated luxury space gay communism, without having some sort of industrial base from somewhere, which they thought would be supplied by the West. That this is, there are. As Kuba pointed out, he actually did a video about this for TIR. The father of Russian Marxism, Grigory Plekhanov, was thought, hey, historical materialism. You can't. What kind of form of social organization you even can have is downstream of the development of the forces of production. What are you talking about? You can have socialism in like Tsarist Russia. You need to have a liberal democratic bourgeois revolution first, and then like a while later you could have your workers' revolution.
I mean, but there's also evidence that Plekhanov actually had Marx suppressed so that he could maintain that. Late Marx in particular.
So actually, let me just before you go back to your point, I just wanted to say on that point, right? So So Plekhanov is the sort of ultra-Orthodox Marxist. He's actually like more Catholic than the Pope on this, because Marx was willing to be a little bit flexible about this. So most famously, Marx wrote this letter responding to a query from the Russian Marxist Vera Zasulich, and then in 1881, and then which is like the way he puts it in the letter is a little bit ambiguous, but then I think there's a much more clear formulation the next year in 1882. There's the introduction to the second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, where he says, okay, maybe you can skip past capitalism in Russia, but only if revolution in Russia becomes a signal for proletarian revolution in the West. And that position, the not more Catholic than the Pope, but exactly as Catholic as the Pope position, was the one that Lenin and Trotsky explicitly had when they were starting the Russian Revolution. I mean, they didn't think that you could go straight to socialism on the basis of the industrial infrastructure of Tsarist Russia. They thought you need to borrow somebody else's industrial infrastructure to make that happen. And
I think that's a critical point that people need to understand when they're assessing the Russian Revolution. I mean, the whole road to socialism is paved with nothing but defeats, as Comrade Rosa says. So we got to learn from those defeats. And the fact is, and I think this is missed out on a lot today by people on the left, because Orthodox Marxist Leninism has become a third world developmentalist program, and a successful one. Like, my strongest defense of China is basically the social democratic reformist defense, which is like, they lifted a hell of a lot of people out of poverty a lot quicker than India. Can't argue with those numbers. Yes, there's problematic things about China, but there are problematic things about everybody. Let's not get on our high horse too much about everything. But you're pointing it out there that Lenin viewed himself as part of an international movement, and these people took internationalism seriously, organizing internationally, strategizing internationally. Today, we have a pale imitation of that, which is this multipolarity where people fantasize about geopolitics, about things they don't affect. Whereas Lenin and Trotsky were operating in a period where you had a vibrant socialist movement that was trying to work tactically to take power in different countries. And the Russian Revolution, I mean, they called it the October Revolution, not the Russian Revolution, because it was supposed to be that signal, and its isolation was its eventual defeat. Its transformation from being a potential spark for an international revolution into basically just a national revolution that ended up liquidating feudalism quicker than the Tsar could have done.
Yeah, I think this is actually important to build off of, though, because we can actually deduce some positive principles from this, because this is both something that is very real for the Soviets. It's very rare for the first, second, and third international. So that's until 1936, the end of the Comintern. We have an international movement. The problem that happens in regards to the Russian Revolution, though, because the Russian Revolution is successful but besieged, all right, it asked, because it's the first successful revolution, other revolutionaries to put their own movements on standstill for the sake of succeeding in Russia. That is a primary agenda of the Comintern, starting actually even before Stalin. Mm-hmm. It starts once you start dealing with the civil wars. We've already talked about the 21 points, which means that the socialist internationals and the communist internationals can't play along, and they never do. This also leads to a whole lot of socialists becoming diehard anti-communists, both in the Russian context. We can talk about all the SRs that went to America that end up working for the Hoover Institution. And in the European context, this is a space where fascists are able to play socialists and communists off each other, particularly in Germany, until they're both weak and they can kill them both. And that's literally what happened. That's not a metaphor. So, that's one thing. Another thing I think this leads us to, and this is something internal to the Bolsheviks and internal to the Soviets, and we'll use the Soviets and not the Russian case, because we're right. We should not actually do the whole anti-communist thing and pretend this is just a Russian issue. Is that the faction banning and the banning and centralization of not just getting rid of like reactionary bourgeois parties. Okay, I think you will have to suppress some of them. Sorry, people who don't think you can suppress anyone. You have to suppress Nazis and probably capitalists too. But the suppression of socialist groups related to you, all right, comes up a lot. And doesn't just come up in the context of the Russian Revolution. It also comes in context in the Mexican Revolution, where eventually you have stuff like the League of Trade Union and the Magonists killing Zapatistas for the liberal state. All right, that really happened. And ironically, the Zapatistas got their land reform and the Magonists just got fucked. But
So I do want to hone in on some of the point that Varn is raising, because this is actually, I will say from my perspective, the biggest thing that I thought was missing from the first discussion. Because I think that like what Gene was talking about I think is really important, and I think that's the sort of crucial Soviet specific dimension of the problem that you're talking about an underdeveloped country that's besieged and on its own, and so more Catholic than the Plekhanov's prediction that you'd have Incan industrialization turned out to be exactly right. That you'd have to if you're like if you need to. Socialism is not supposed to be a developmental program, right? That's what capitalism is for. Socialism is supposed to be about taking the machine that's built up by capitalism and socializing it.
But I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? Capitalism, socialism, especially if we're reconfiguring the geography to emphasize more on the global south and the what was called the third world, has to have a developmentalist answer and program, or else it will run into the exact same problems. It will continue to grind against the material question.
Yeah. So, but this is why, by the way, this is one of the reasons that I think it's not a secret that that as once as a young and foolish young man, as a Trotskyist, and one of the reasons that I'm even besides the fact that I don't really think that word means anything if you live in America in 2023, one of the reasons I no longer am, even when thinking back to Russia in the 1920s, is that I think that the program of Trotsky's left opposition was incoherent, that they wanted to have restored workers' democracy and also have rapid-fire industrialization and collectivization. I don't think you could do both. I think that if you're basically trying to replicate what took centuries of bloodshed to do in England, to sort of turn peasants into factory workers, and to have and to rapidly build up this industrial machine. It's going to be very difficult to do that in a cozy and consensual way. So that's the issue that I think that Gene was very rightly highlighting the TIR discussion, but the point that I think Varn was just getting to, that in the last few minutes are together, I really want to throw to the panel in a sort of more explicit way, is just like, okay, look, cards on the table. I mean, part of my takeaway from the Russian case is, I guess what if you don't like it, you could call a liberal proceduralist takeaway, which is that you can't I don't think you can have a complete account of what went wrong here without using phrases like, civil liberties and, multi-party democracy and stuff like that. I think that those things are actually, as it turns out, really important. And the idea that you're going to have a state that's actually a worker state, that actually has some kind of mass working class participation in the political process, at the same time as people who are accused of counter-revolutionaries are, get a midnight knock, doesn't really make a lot of sense. That I think that you do need, I don't buy at all the idea that it's like, oh well, different political parties just represent different social classes, so you wouldn't need parties, in a classless society or anything like that. I think that you need to have those mechanisms in place if you actually want what you end up with to be an expansion of democracy from what you get in capitalist democracy, rather than rather than a contraction of it. Like I have to, and again, I'm just sort of wearing my, petty bourgeois liberal proceduralism on my sleeve here, and I'll let you guys react to this however you want to. That, like, one of the takeaways here has got to be, if somebody tells you that we're going to have a temporary emergency dictatorship, but don't worry, we'll have a full-flowered socialist democracy at some point in the future.
Violence,
temporary has a way of becoming forever.
The problem is violence is an inherently conservatizing force with a small c, right? People, after living in, like, as Kuba was saying, after living in traumatic situations, they just want to go back to normal, and there's a kind of conservatizing tendency in that. I think that's what Stalinism represented to a certain degree. Stalinism saw the reversal, a lot of social liberalism of the early Bolshevik period, and of course the war situation in the early Bolshevik period, of course, led to the suppression of alternative voices within the communist movement, because of course there's this ever dangerous tendency of, once you start and this is a line you have to draw, as Varn says, right? There are forces that, let's say you had a revolution, that you couldn't allow to operate freely in the country because they would do like terrorism or things like that. But once you draw that line, suddenly there is an instinct and a tendency to draw that line ever shorter and shorter, excluding ever more people from that line, until you end up with just a very narrow circle of people who are, because they've drawn that line so small around themselves, deeply paranoid about, like, their position. I mean, like, So I think that there's a danger. Like, war has this conservatizing effect on people. It kills some of the most dedicated cadre, and then you end up with a kind of exhausted population. So, and of course, because these socialist revolutions, and not just socialists, go back to 1906 in Iran, 1908 in the Ottoman Empire, 1911 in China, Portugal, Mexico. These revolutions these liberal revolutions came to power with, big dreams and ideals, but degenerated very quickly into, into kind of like a narrow elite.
Luxury automated catboy communism.
Yeah, or not even in the case of the liberal revolutions of the early 20th century. The Ottoman, Persian, Chinese constitutional revolutions, they were in part smashed by imperialism to a greater or lesser degree. But we're also victims of the revolutionary cadre who made those revolutions, either completely falling out with each other or just having successive purges. And it's not like a purely, if people want to make this like, oh, it's a communist problem. This is a problem that happened for the revolutionaries in the Ottoman Empire, in Republican China, in Portugal in the 19th century, like liberals, right? Liberal revolutions has happened in. This is a general problem of these kind of modern style of political revolutions, whether they're proletarian revolutions, socialist revolutions, or liberal revolutions. That there is this, there is this tendency for them to degenerate into a kind of, or some form of either dictatorship, like narrow dictatorship of a kind of elite, or maybe you have a personalized regime, or maybe you have a small party elite, or what have you. But they end with the suppression of civil society, which I would note that for Marx, if we go back to the master, I mean, that's where he saw socialism emanating from, not so much from a top-down elite, but from organs built in civil society. And that was the model of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which was the gold standard until
it failed.
Until it failed. Yeah.
Although even Lenin, after the Russian Revolution, after World War I, after the Russian Revolution, in a pamphlet with the unsubtle title "The Proletarian Revolution" and the Renegade Kautsky, even in there he says, before World War I, this is about as close as we had anywhere in the world to what a workers' party should be.
Just I have one very quick observation to make, which is when it comes to multi-party electoralism or civil liberties, the whole game is creating the apparatus of coercion, law enforcement, legality, judicial oversight that can make those rights enforceable in society, that can push back not just against, let's say, popular excesses, because often the people, are very zealous in persecuting perceived enemies of the people.
But they say the purges is not just Stalin; it's also like the Soviet people getting revenge on people that piss them off. I mean,
that's what happened in the Cultural Revolution. You take the lid off.
But also
what happens to the Salem witch trials, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And this is why there is something to the liberal preoccupation with the rule of law and the elevation of the legal profession into something like a monkhood, a priesthood, because there is a great deal that depends on preserving a judicial system that ultimately is not reducible to individual or class interests. It's something that is extraordinarily challenging to do. There's no easy way to get to that outcome. And that's because of its association with liberal bourgeois politics. It's also a place where leftists think that you can be more based by throwing those considerations out the window, shooting all the lawyers. Right?
So there's two tendencies that I think that we can elevate here. One, don't ban factions both within the party and in general society at large, and in the international. That's also got to be dealt with. Like, this is not, in the case of leftist revolutions, you're not dealing with a national polity. I think two, I've always taken the dictatorship of the proletariat to mean this, but I know that that's like a Draperite position and people can get mad at me about it. But I think what that is establishing law and systems that are based in proletarian, i.e. workers' associations, and that means you need law, etc. The suspension of law for, say, the bourgeoisie is not so we can murder them all after the revolution, because if we've done our job right, they aren't bourgeoisie anymore because that function is gone. It might take a while to do that. I mean, if we think about like the bourgeois revolutions, how long it took for them to get rid of the aristocracy, and in some places still they haven't done it. The first liberal revolutions in England, they still have their aristocracy to this day. Spain still does, etc. But it was not a quick process, even in the cases of developed socialist society. And I think we do have to realize that. But what we can't do, I think, for example, and we talked about this in an episode that hasn't come out yet, but when me and Kuba talked about class society and non-capitalist stuff, and stuff that Marx doesn't talk about. But for example, if terror is your only means of controlling the center of society, the nomenclatura, the bureaucrats, etc., that's not a sustainable society. Mm-hmm. You can't terrorize your administrators forever. No society has ever done it and survived. And what you have to do is somehow have those administrators be of the politics and the class that instantiates that. And that's got to be through basically what we might call proletarian law, right? But that does mean that we have to recognize political divisions within workers because they're real. They're not all just going to be like, even if they're all socialist and communist, which they're not, but even if they were, what that means for them is going to be divisive and antagonistic. The idea that after the revolution, social antagonism goes away because we got rid of the main class conflict, I think is not just naive, it's just flat wrong.
Yeah, but there's something kind of, it's very naive, because it shouldn't take you very long to think of a lot of sources of social antagonism besides class antagonism. But it's like, there's something that's like, honestly, and I know there's a strand of classical Marxism and frankly even things in Marx that, like point that direction, but it's like it's this whole idea that it's like, oh, you're just going to have this kind of neutral administration of things rather than like something where people are really contested for power in a political way. Like I think there's something that's like almost anti-human about it because you like like people in take away class conflict and people are just like monoliths who don't like you don't have.
There are lots of issues we could still murder each other over.
Yeah, people are very creative. They'll come up with new stuff. All right, we might have to leave it there for right now. So can go to the post game. Be joined by our live show producer Jordan. Going to talk about a good friend of the show, James Lindsay. But I do want to give everybody a chance to plug their stuff, maybe going counterclockwise, because, Gene, since the last time you were on the show, you have a new show.
Oh, yeah, I got a radio show. So I'm on Southwest Missouri Public Radio once a month with Talking History, where we talk to scholars and historians about history stuff, which is pretty fun, and I do it with the history department at Missouri State, and also my dear friend Patrick from formerly off the Hoot and Holler podcast, and that is, if you're in Southwest Missouri, once a month on the first Thursday at midday, or first Thursday of the month at midday. Or you can catch it online, and we have a Twitter account, and it's released as a podcast. We have 2 episodes, one about the American Civil War with Jeremy Neely, talking about the experience for how the war had a revolutionary experience, was a revolutionary experience for a homemaker in the frontier states. And then we have another episode with Dr. Sarah Mellors, who works on birth control in China. We talk specifically about the one-child policy, what it meant, how it developed, and so if you want to know what happens to hot wads of nut in China, there's your episode for us. And
it's like you're reading my mind.
And then on Thursday, on this Wednesday, for This Is Revolution, my compact article on anti-imperialism had some criticism, so I invited the fellow who criticized it, Pavlos, onto the show for White Guy Wednesday to keep, give Kuba and Varn some time off so they can ensure that their skin remains pale. So when they come back to White Guy Wednesday, they won't be all tanned and swarthy.
Makes sense. The mention of universities reminded me that I did not plug, and I probably should have. Day after tomorrow on Wednesday. So we'll edit this out of the podcast version because by the time the podcast comes out, this is going to be irrelevant. But on Wednesday, I believe at 3:00 at UC Irvine, there's going to be a panel on podcasting and media, which is primarily for students, but is going to be open to the public. With me and This Revolution host Jason Miles and Matt Chrisman and Amber Lee Frost, and it's going to be moderated by our friend Catherine Liu. So when I think of it, I'll put a information about that in the description for this. But continuing, see Derrick Varn.
Yeah, so I do Varn Blog. You can find it at Varn Blog. Very easy because I'm lazy and couldn't name anything cool anymore. I used all my names on podcasts that failed. And we also have sub shows because I'm also lazy, and whenever I come up with a new topic and show, I just have another show underneath that show. And that is with Activations, which is the one I'm going to plug today. And that is with Jordan Dubin, and also sometimes our Polish Canadian deep stater, where we talk about either non-Marxist historical stuff. We're going through various theories of class and medieval society and modern society, etc. Right now, we're also doing a series on Hal Draper and So there's that. And then there's the main interview show. You can find at the same place. If you want to catch me on other podcasts, I'm a regular guest over at Antifada. We do a sub show called Diving into the Wreckage, where I get into depressing economic stats for hours on end. That show is available for the first hour for free, and then it's for patrons only, for Antifada patrons. So that's where you can find me. And also, I do White Guy Wednesday. It's regular enough for me to say that I'm a member of a crew, but not regular enough for me to tell you exactly when I'm going to be on, except that it's on Wednesdays usually when I'm on with these two gentlemen here, Baba Bajalan and good old Deep State, our Polish-Canadian spy. All right, now let our Polish-Canadian spy plug what he needs to plug.
Between the remaining 3 squares on the board and David Griscom in the chat, every franchise that I'm associated with is represented here. So all I can add is I'll be on next Wednesday for White Guy Wednesdays. We get a break tomorrow. There's the class show that I'm doing with Varn and Jordan. Recording a new one tomorrow, and part 2 is going to be released soon. Anybody around in Greater Europe, first week of July, hit me up in the DMs, because I'll be there for a wedding, and I'll stick around to pay my respects to the fatherland.
To the king. Have you pledged allegiance to good King Charles?
King Sigismund, the rightful emperor of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Ah, yeah.
The Charles hashtag not my king.
It was kind of, we were talking about the Soviet Union stuff earlier. I was thinking that two of us on this screen wrote sympathetic obituaries of Mikhail Gorbachev last year, and how many screens could you say that about? But anyway, I'm gonna cut it right there. As a tragic figure, couldn't have succeeded, but was trying to do the right things. In any case, I'm gonna cut. Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna cut it there, so we could go to the post game for Jordan with Jordan for GTAA patrons. If you are not a patron, just a reminder, the monthly cost of a milkshake at a 50s Nostalgia Diner in 1994, get access to every post game after the regular episodes. You get the Discord server. You get uncomfortably long hugs when we see you in person. You get all kinds of things. So do that. And if you are a patron, you should already have the email with the link for the post game. I will see all of you gentlemen very soon, I'm sure. Left is best.